Okay, so oh wow, so we're just getting started. Joining us just in the group before we get started is Molly. We've never met personally, but she is also an intercultural trainer. She's Malaysian, but she has a Malaysian Chinese or Chinese Malaysian, I don't know what you want to call it, but all of her experience is with Germany and German companies. And I think she might even be living in Germany right now. Molly, I'm going to go ahead and get started with the presentation. I'm going to give you a chance to introduce yourself when we get into the next section. There are several Germans on this call and several experts on China who are also German. So there's going to be a lot of good information exchanged during this event. I'm going to go ahead and get started with my part of the presentation, and then we're going to get everybody involved. So today, again, for those of you who are attending for the first time, this is the third in a series of kind of events, and they kind of build on each other. So I'm going to go really quickly through some of the things we went through last time. But today we're going to talk about our unknown unknowns. Okay, so these are obviously the things we don't know, and how that impacts our ability to be successful in China. So I want to first welcome everybody on board. This is kind of like a participation question. So I've already talked with some of you before the event. So I kind of want you to just type into the chat, what culture do you most affiliate yourself with? So for Molly, this may be interesting because she's familiar with multiple cultures. Is it Malaysian? Is it Chinese? Is it German? Whatever it is. So what culture do you most affiliate yourself with? I know the answer to some of you, Klaus and Christian, you can type it in the chat. But the question I really want you to think about is, have you ever thought about the things that you don't know, and how that might impact your success doing business in China or just doing business across cultures? Okay, so we'll look at the chat once we get into the discussion. If you want to just type your name, the culture you affiliate yourself with, we'll get to it in the chat. But this is kind of the context of this entire kind of presentation. All right. So today's agenda, and you'll know this if you've attended the previous events, I got to get everybody in the right mindset. And I'm going to explain why for the new visitors. We're going to talk about our unknown unknowns and something I think is even worse than things you don't know when you're doing business in China. And the main thing is we're going to talk about how do we create new patterns of interaction. And that's basically whether it's with a local employee, if you're talking about China, or a supplier, or a partner, or a government official. Last event, we talked about new patterns of behavior. This event, where we're gonna take it to the next level, and how do you create new patterns of interaction? I'm gonna do a case study called Paratrooper Manager. In Chinese, for all of you, I know a lot of you speak Chinese. In Chinese, it's 空降部队. And this was my experience when I was employed by a German company and I was sent to China to be the Asia Pacific sales director based in China. And I also had to manage a local sales team in China. Some of the things that I encountered, I'm going to extract those into a case study to really give you an idea of how I try to train, coach, and teach my students and clients in order to achieve new patterns or winning patterns of interaction, which ultimately leads to better results and better outcomes. Whatever time we have at the end, we're going to share our experiences, do a Q&A. People who were on last night's event know that I stopped right at 90 minutes because I know everybody's time is valuable, so we're not going to go over, or we're going to try not to go over. And we're really going to focus today on how do we create new patterns of interaction, in our case, when we do business with people in China, okay? So when we interact with other people, obviously there are things we don't know, and the things that we don't know have a potential to hurt our ability to achieve whatever we want to achieve, okay? There are also things we don't know. And for many people who are doing business across cultures, and even for me, fluent in Mandarin Chinese, many, many years of doing business in China. My wife is actually from mainland China. There are still things that I don't know. And a lot of times when you let these create these negative stacks of emotions with the people that you're working with. And we talked about negative emotional stacking last time. Often you're shocked in very disturbing ways, and that changes your own attitude, that changes your own mindset, and other people can feel that. So it's, in Chinese, we call it 恶性循环. It just means an escalation of negative interactions. And that's what we really want to avoid. We want to avoid creating the negative emotional stacks that are caused by the things we don't know. Okay? So the unknown unknowns is really the focus of what we're going to talk about today. So one of the, what I call the essential soft skills that matter. When you're doing business across cultures, you can try to acquire this knowledge, but there's essential soft skills that I think are really important. They are awareness and empathy. And awareness includes self-awareness, cultural awareness, situational awareness, and obviously empathy is understanding how other people think and how they feel. And that's extremely difficult if you don't really use the triggers that I'm going to talk about. So when we're journeying into China as a foreigner, we always start with the things we know. So usually when people go to China, they know their products, they know their technology, they know their company, they know how they want to do business, they know their business processes, they know their strategy, they know their global strategy. And then there are things that they know they don't know, the known unknowns. So for example, if you don't speak Chinese and you're doing business in China, you know you don't speak Chinese. And since you know that, you can prepare for it. You can hire an interpreter, or you can take Mandarin lessons and start learning Chinese. Where we really get into trouble is the things that we don't know. And these are our unknown unknowns. I didn't really come up with this phrase. I think Donald Rumsfeld came up with this phrase in the first Iraq war, where it was a quagmire and the US wasn't achieving the results they wanted to achieve. And he basically said, the reason is because there are things we don't know. And these are our unknown unknowns. The final thing is what I call false known knowns. Okay, so this is something that I kind of really thought about, and this is what creates the most problems doing business across cultures. When we interact with other people, the things we think we know that are actually false within their cultural context can actually kind of ruin us and our ability to function in their arena. All right, is that noise bothering people? If it is, I can actually close the window. Hold on 1 second. Okay, so hopefully that's a little bit better. And so the case study today is I'm going to be talking about my own false known knowns when I was sent to be an expat leader in China, and I was a paratrooper manager. And the thing that we all have to remember when we're doing business in any foreign country is that it's their arena, it's their rules. And a lot of, I'm an American, so I'm going to say that, a lot of Americans forget that. 10 years ago, if Americans forgot that, there weren't as many repercussions because China wasn't nearly as strong as it is today. But for Americans who go to China now and they forget that this is China, this is their country, this is their arena, this is their rules, then you're going to get a lot more backlash and a lot more negative ramifications and repercussions if you're not aware of that. All right, so again, this is back to the previous event before, this is not really training, so I want to get everybody into the right mindset first. A lot of people who are going to other countries, a guy who was on last night, he sent me an email. He says, right now I'm really focused on learning Mandarin. Well, that's all great. Learning to speak another language, learning about the culture, this is all knowledge. But what you do with that knowledge will translate into the outcomes that you receive. So last time, we're not going to get into it this time. Last time we talked about people like me, other intercultural trainers, other Chinese experts, they can all give you knowledge. But the action that you actually decide to take is going to lead to the better results and the better outcomes that you want to achieve. So the most beneficial adjustments that I believe we can make as foreign business people doing business in another country is the adjustments to our, I call it AMA values. This is your attitude, your mindset, and your approach. Okay, and then it's really difficult to adjust your attitude, adjust your mindset. So we actually need mental triggers that we practice and condition ourselves for a different attitude, different mindset, and ultimately at least a different approach. We went through this last time. We're not going to go through this time. It's all on the replay. But basically what we said is, as an example, everybody wants to be healthier. And if you want to be healthier, everybody knows the key to losing weight or being healthier is to adjust your diet and to exercise more. But the reason why most people, 99% of the people who want to get healthier aren't at their ideal weight or aren't at their ideal health is because of their psychology and their motivation, which is basically your attitude and your mindset prevent you from achieving your weight loss goals or your health goals, not your knowledge. So that's what I'm stressing here, because it doesn't matter how many cultural dichotomies I illustrate. If you don't take the proper action, you don't adjust your attitude and mindset, you're not going to be able to achieve the results that you want. So in the last event, we talked about the triggers, the mental triggers. And the mental triggers are basically the bridge between the knowledge that people like me and Molly can give you as an intercultural trainer and the winning, the new and winning approach or new winning MO. MO is modus operandi. This is how you normally conduct yourself and how you like to do business and how you behave when you're doing certain things. It's just your normal way of behavior. It's your normal pattern of behavior. And the key is you really have to practice using these mental triggers. And we did that in the last event with some of the cultural dichotomies that we went over. And just to remind everybody, the mental triggers are things that we were really good at when we were younger, but things that we stop using as we get older and we get more set in our ways. And that's really imagination, 想象力. It really has to be positive, and curiosity. A lot of, again, I'm going to use Americans because I'm an American. Most Americans who are going to China, they lack curiosity. Yes, they're interested in the culture. Yes, they're interested in the food, but they lack the curiosity of what people really think and why they think a certain way. And what happens is they end up being more judgmental. And that's a very negative attitude to have when you're trying to do business across cultures. All right, so I want to remind everybody to consciously and proactively try to use these triggers. We went through exercises in the last event with the examples of the cultural dichotomies, but this is always a reminder that I'm going to go through. And our goal when we're going to China or we're going to another country isn't to learn how to persuade other people. Our goal is to learn how to influence their behavior with ours for mutual winning benefits. Okay, so this is just the example of what we talked about. One of the cultural dichotomies that we went through over the last event is truth. Westerners tend to think in absolute truths, meaning facts and literal meanings, and they speak in a direct manner. Chinese tend to think in relative truths, and they communicate in a very figurative style of saving face. It's very indirect, okay? So last time we used our imaginations as a trigger, and we said, well, how does this affect business partners? How do you make them feel seen, understood, and safe if you're negotiating? And how does it affect employees? If you're speaking in a very direct manner, do they feel criticized, controlled, or ignored? And if you're empathetic and you know that they are, then that's probably not the best way to communicate with them in order to get them to change behavior. Okay, so one of the tactics that we use for people who haven't practiced using these soft skills is, well, when you go to China, you should not expect that people will say what they mean or mean what they say. Now, from an American perspective, if you don't mean what you say and say what you mean, I think you're a liar, and that's a negative. But when you go to China, you have to have a really positive attitude that that's just culturally how they communicate, and you need to figure out how to adjust your approach accordingly. Okay, so there's a lot of conceptual stuff. Now what we want to do is we want to see how this works in practice, all right? And this is the framework that will help you visualize what it means to use a mental trigger and why we should use a mental trigger. And whether we're going to China and negotiating, we're setting up a factory and we're dealing with government officials, or we're hiring employees and we're trying to develop a good relationship with our employees, it's always a series of interactions. And in this series of interactions, as you're developing your Guanxi relationship or whatever you want to call it, there are key interactions that will either lead to positive emotional stacks or negative stacks. And as these accumulate, a backlash can happen. An employee can resign. A partner can become a competitor. These are the things that can happen, not because Chinese people are unethical or corrupt, but because of the negative emotional stacks they start to feel because they're not getting the type of reciprocity they need from you in the relationship. Okay, so whenever there are key interactions, we obviously have how we interpret what's going on. We have our natural perceptions. And the reason we do that naturally is because it gives us a feeling of being in control. When I use my worldview to judge what's going on or to kind of say what's going on, it gives me a sense of being in control because that's what I'm used to. That's what I'm accustomed to. And based on that, I form expectations. Now, if I'm doing business in China, I've heard these things about Chinese people being corrupt and whatever. And so I'm cautious. I have a lot of contingencies that I want to build into the contract that I want to ask for in the agreement. And the attention, in my opinion, is lagging because we're just focused on these transactional things on the surface, as opposed to really getting down deep in how do I develop a good relationship, a trustworthy relationship to be able to move forward. And ultimately, for those who have been in China long enough, Klaus has been in China for 30 years, I'm sure there are certain situations, especially early on, where things got out of control, a relationship got out of control. And that's the example that I'm going to give today about how somebody that reported directly to me, the relationship got out of control. Now, during the key interactions, most of us lack awareness and empathy. And this is where our unknown unknowns or our false known knowns really affect our ability to have the right attitude, mindset, and approach. And that means we don't have the right MO for interacting with the people that we want to form these relationships with. And that creates what I call reality A. That's currently what we experience in China. And you'll hear this from a lot of foreigners. They complain. They complain about Chinese people this and Chinese people that. We have a lot of Germans on this call. So the number one complaint I hear from my German friends and German colleagues is when they're having meetings, they can't get the local Chinese people to share their opinion and speak up. And well, there's a reason why. Use your imagination, use your curiosity, and you'll be able to figure out a different way. But that is the current reality. Now, what we propose is instead of using our natural perceptions and our natural interpretations of the behavior and the words of the people that we're engaging with, this is when we use the mental triggers, positive imagination and purpose-driven curiosity to reimagine and reframe our interactions and our relationship. Okay, and we did this through examples last time. And with that, we start to set a different set of expectations. Okay, we're empathetic, we have cultural awareness, we have self-awareness. So our attention isn't on these transactional things that we want to avoid. Our attention is more toward leading indicators, which is more focused on how do we collaborate. And in Chinese vernacular, how do we develop real Guanxi relationships? And what you will discover as you do this, because I've discovered this, is I'm always in control. Okay, because very few things that Chinese people say now shock me or surprise me. And I don't misinterpret what they actually mean because, well, in literal terms, they don't mean what they say and they don't say what they mean. But how do you interpret that as a foreigner? This is what we practice and this is what we train to do. And this is how we create reality B, our experience interacting with people in China. This is how it gets better. Okay, so I'm gonna illustrate all this in a really quick case study. Okay, the case study is called Paratrooper Manager. I'm gonna contrast my reality A, which is my inner voice telling me how I should interpret the behavior and the things that's going on. And these are my false known knowns. And then I'm going to contrast this with a reality B, which is if I had known what I do now back then and I had deployed these mental triggers, I would have had a new approach and I could have changed the reality of the situation. All right, so the background really quickly. This was back in 2011, 2012. German parent company. I reported directly to the corporate headquarters in Germany. I was hired directly by the German CEO. I was living in America. I flew to Germany for the last round of interviews, met with the CEO, met with the advisory board, met with everybody, and I got an offer with no regional involvement. That means nobody in China or nobody in Asia who I would be working with and who I would be leading and managing, none of those people were involved in my hiring decision. They didn't even meet me. I was given the task to grow regional sales from Asia Pacific, representing 6% to 25%. So this is a true paratrooper manager situation. I work for a German company, I'm not German. I'm going to China, I'm not Chinese, all right? I even come from outside of the industry. It's a new market, so I don't bring language skills, I don't bring technical know-how, I don't bring really anything to the table other than the CEO hired me. This is a true paratrooper manager. My title was Asia Pacific Sales Director. I was based in China. I had 4 direct reports. I had the China sales manager. I got to hire a personal sales assistant. I had the Japanese general manager who was responsible for Japan and Korea. And then there was a German based in Switzerland who was managing all the Asia Pacific, Southeast Asian countries that didn't have employees but worked through channel partners and distributors. He also reported to me. Okay, so this was my direct reports. And the Germans on this call may know how Germans like to structure their hierarchy. Everybody at my level, regional sales director, there was 4. There was EMEA 1, EMEA 2, Asia Pacific, and North and South America. We were all the same level as the key account managers and the highest level person who was managing all the products, product director. We were all the same level, same corporate level. We were 1 step removed from the CEO. All right, so that's the background. There was a general manager who was the factory manager in China, who basically everybody reported to him, except for me. I had no reporting relationship to him. The German company decided that you would just report directly to corporate headquarters. And I was on the official payroll, so legally I was an employee and he was the general manager, but my reporting relationship was directly to Germany. All right. What we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about my relationship with the China sales manager. Okay. And the key thing to keep in mind is he was hired to be the first sales guy in China 10 years before I came onto the scene. Okay. So before me, he was running the show. He was the first salesperson that the company hired 10 years ago, and he had built the sales team up to what it was. And now I come along and suddenly there's an extra layer of management between him and who he normally reported to. He used to report to Germany. Now he reports to me. And that is the background, okay? So the honeymoon period is something we talked about last time, because Chinese people are the most gracious, hospitable hosts that you can ever imagine. So for all of you, whether you travel China for the first time or you're a foreigner, you go to China frequently, you're going to experience what we call the honeymoon period. And that's what it means is somebody's got a sign picking you up at the airport. If you bring your family and you have meetings, they're going to arrange for them to go on tours. They're going to ask you what you need, what you like to eat, where you want to go. Everything is arranged. That's called the honeymoon period. All right. And what a lot of foreigners fail to realize is the honeymoon period and the way they talk to you and the way they treat you, that's a facade. Because that's not how they think, and that's definitely not how they feel. That's them giving you face and telling you what you want to hear, and then behind your back, they say something totally different. And that's where some of the negative things pop up, and we experience, most foreigners will experience an unexpected disappointment. Okay, I now call that a China leadership dilemma, which is the book that I'm writing, but that's what happens because most people get used to the honeymoon period. It feels good, and they don't realize to get something done in China, you're not living in the honeymoon period. All right. So the first key interaction with Richard who was the China sales manager, was Honeymoon Treatment. Okay, so the symptoms were this. He paid for all my meals, lunches and dinners. So we had, we worked at a kind of factory, so there was a cafeteria, but whenever we went out for lunch to chat, or before I got my company car, he would drive me from the factory to my home. And after work, we would always go out to dinner before he dropped me home. And he always paid. I tried to pay. And then ultimately I just said, well, since I sign your expense reports, please expense it. So he chauffeured me around, business and personal. He tried to discover what my interests were. I like to play tennis. And the next thing I know, he's reserved an indoor tennis court because it was wintertime. And we played tennis. And of course, he wouldn't let me pay. He paid. All right. So these are the symptoms of the honeymoon treatment that I was experiencing. Now, Chio means what were the clues? What was kind of odd and kind of inconsistent? All right. So this is where you're trying to use your imagination and your curiosity to kind of figure out what's actually going on. So my Chio should have been, well, this behavior never ended. If it happened before I got my own car, before I got my company car, it may have been okay, but it kind of never ended. And of course, I was also signing his expense reports. So us going out and then him expensing it, and I didn't even really look at it that closely. That was just kind of strange and odd, okay? And how long did this kind of behavior last? How long did this type of interaction last? Well, basically until it was too late. And what do I mean by that? Well, during my whole time, him being my best friend and whatever, he was slowly spreading false insinuations in Germany, because he had been with the company for over 10 years, to create what I call a rising tide of doubt regarding my performance. Okay, so we'll get into that later. Now, reality A, this is what my inner voice was telling me during this whole period of time. Well, he's just trying to develop Guanxi with me, and that's what I need with him too. So I'm not going to think too much about it. If I had used some of my mental triggers, which is curiosity, I would have really thought, well, how does my presence, my Paratrooper Manager, 空降部队, how does my presence affect his perception about his own authority, his own influence, and his own opportunities? So in Chinese culture, there's a term that I'm sure all the Chinese speakers have heard of. It's 睁一只眼, 闭一只眼. And what that means is sometimes you just have to look the other way. And in a literal sense, probably there was a lot of corrupt activities going on. And because when I first took on this assignment, I didn't give anybody any impression that I was flexible, which means I wanted to follow the rules, especially with ethics and compliance. And because of my prior experience in China, because I've gone on customer calls, I've developed the market, I've managed channel partners, there was really nothing that could be hidden from me because I've seen it all, I've exposed a lot of it. So Richard felt that I was a threat to whatever he was trying to do. I didn't really give him an indication that I was willing to work with him in the sense of if he's doing something that would technically be corrupt. Key interaction number 2, he was always my trusted advisor. So what does that mean? That means I was the Asia Pacific sales director. He was the China sales manager. That means he always gave me advice about other things. He would advise me that, Korea should be managed from China, not from Japan. He would talk about Korea and Japan have this history and, whatever. So he would give me all of these reasons that I should try to take Korea away from the Japanese general manager and shift it to China where we can manage it or he can manage it. He suggested that I set up a sales office in the Waigaoqiao Free Trade Zone in Shanghai. Okay? And he constantly reminded me that there was a conflict of interest within the company. And I knew about this. When I interviewed in Germany, the CEO told me, our factory manager, he set up another company and his wife is currently the president. and they buy our products. Okay, so there's a potential conflict of interest, but Richard kept on reminding me of this. And what that did is that drove a wedge between me and the only other high-level German in China, because I was really trying to figure out what was going on. I was trying to monitor his behavior. So the Chio was, what was the clue? What was inconsistent? What was odd? Well, the biggest clue was I actually ended up doing a lot of research, going on a lot of meetings to figure out, should we set up a free trade, set up a sales office in the free trade zone? How would that benefit local customers' abilities to get things in duty free or not, or be able to get a duty drawback or whatever? And I made a presentation at a global sales meeting in which the CEO was present. And the CEO told me, you know, Gene, we already opened up a sales office in the free trade zone, and then it really wasn't that much of a benefit to keep it, and we closed it. So this was a very obvious clue that Richard was sending me out on kind of a wild goose chase, as we say in America. He was trying to distract me from really trying to figure out what was going on in China. And this happened consistently. Okay. So my inner voice was saying, you know what? It's valuable to get all of these insights. And it's great to have an ally to collaborate with. Because I always say, well, I mean, if somebody wants to give you advice, you definitely want to listen. Whether you take the advice or not, that's your own personal decision. But you should never deny people to give you advice. Okay, that was my thinking when I was in the job. But because I didn't deploy my mental trigger, I wasn't curious. I should have been asking, why isn't Richard asking for more support in his territory? Okay. Every piece of advice he was giving me was what we should do in Japan, what we should do in Southeast Asia, what the factory manager's conflict of interest was. The only thing that really might have affected his sales is to set up a free trade office, but he never asked me to go on joint calls. He never asked me to try to get more support from Germany. It just, you know, that wasn't his priority. His priority was orchestrating what I was involved with, if I look back in hindsight. And then that leads to the third and final key interaction, in which he was my scheduler. So what does that mean? That means, you know, several times I wanted to organize a sales luncheon. So, you know, I'm the new sales manager or sales director. There's like 9 people that report to me directly or indirectly. I have a sales team. So I wanted to organize a lunch to meet all of these people that I didn't know, who didn't report directly to me, but instead reported to Richard. And what Richard said was, you know, he always said they are too busy. Okay. And he advised me that it would be a bad image for me to take the sales team out to lunch. And he said the reason is because, you know, this is a factory, everybody eats in the cafeteria. It's not a good look if you take everybody out to lunch. And I thought, you know, maybe he has some merit, but in my entire time, I only finally was able to get a lunch. And so like every week I said, you know, let's schedule a lunch. Finally, we reserved this restaurant and we had a lunch, but it took a lot. And then every time I wanted to visit the key accounts in China, he told me, well, you know, I had just visited them last week, so it's too early to visit them again. And because you're at such a high level, they would really want to give you face and make special arrangements. So let's try to schedule it for later. So every time I wanted to visit a key account in China, he would make some reason for us not to have that visit. And he basically set me off to figure out about a free trade zone and also about Korea and Japan. So I was flying to Japan every week, working with the guy in Japan, talking about Korea. My eyes were not really thinking about what was on China. And I kind of knew that these were excuses that didn't make a whole lot of sense. But because I was distracted by all of these other things, I couldn't really pay attention to it. So what was my inner voice telling me? It was actually telling me this is a little odd. But it was also telling me that, well, I shouldn't make an issue of it because I want to give him face. Okay, so as everybody knows, mienzi or face is very important. But the reality is, if I had deployed my mental triggers, if I had been curious, I would have really been asking this question. Why is he limiting my access with the local salespeople? And why is he limiting my interaction with our key accounts? So that's obviously what was happening in hindsight, but I kind of missed those clues 10 years ago when I first started this assignment. All right, by the time I realized what was happening, which means that he was spreading rumors and insinuating that I wasn't doing a good job with all of his connections in Germany, even directly with the CEO, it wasn't worth fighting to try to reverse all the misperception. What I ended up doing, because of my level of self-awareness, I think if I would have fought, I might have won, because one of the interesting that happened in this company is the person between me and the CEO, which is the global sales director, I don't remember what his title was, he was hired after me, which means he did not have these previous relationships with Richard, and he did not have these previous relationships with all the other people that were now reporting to him. And in our weekly calls, he said, Gene, everything you're doing is right. Don't worry about what they're saying in Germany. I'll protect you. But when this rising tide of misinformation was too much for him, we had this meeting. I can still remember it. He goes, Gene, Richard actually had a meeting with the CEO, and when he asked, how do you think Gene is doing? He basically implied that you weren't really doing your job. And he said, what do you want to do about it? So I can remember really clearly, I could already sense what was going on. I wasn't confronting Richard directly, but I knew what was going on. I just said, you know what? I think it might be time for us to negotiate an amicable separation. And my boss, his name was Wolfgang Bauer. He basically said, Gene, I'm so relieved to hear you say that. If you're willing to negotiate an amicable separation, then I will make sure that it's a win-win for all of us. So I got a really nice severance package. I left quietly. I didn't say another word to Richard. I just left. And that was the end of that experience. But the key is not, I actually accomplished a lot of things in that experience in the shorter period of time. But in the case study, it was really a failure, because there's another Chinese term. It's called 台阶下, which means when people are doing something bad or they say something that makes you angry or you're in a confrontation, do you give them a path to step down and save face? Okay. 我有没有给他台阶下? So in hindsight, Richard was probably afraid that I would expose his corrupt activities as the only person who could speak Chinese managing all of the sales in all of China, because all the Germans who would travel in and go on sales calls, they didn't speak Chinese. They didn't understand what was going on. I did speak Chinese. I knew exactly what was going on. So what I never did is I didn't talk about those things, and I didn't give him a path to kind of get away from those activities if that was what he was doing. And I didn't give him a way to save face, and I didn't give him a way to actually create even a better situation for himself by truly working with me, as opposed to just giving me all this advice. All right. So this is what we call an unexpected disappointment, because I was using my normal modus operandi of having experience in China, being fluent in Chinese, and treating people with respect, listening, and whatever. And this still happened. And this is what I now call a China leadership dilemma. It's because I didn't learn how to think about China in a different way. And because I didn't, I achieved an unexpected disappointment. So this is the final slide. This is basically how this all ties together. So in the event, I think the last event, we talked about two of the cultural dichotomies. And this is really just knowledge and insights. And at the beginning, we said having knowledge by itself really isn't going to change any outcomes or change any results. It really requires you to deploy your mental triggers so you can actually change your approach. You need to make adjustments to your attitude, mindset, and approach. You need to understand, even though you've read all this negative news in the media about China and their behavior and what the Chinese are doing, stealing intellectual property and all this stuff, how do you adjust your attitude to be more accommodating? How do you adjust your mindset to be more accepting? And how do you adjust your approach to generate greater harmony? And as we went through last time, if you use positive imagination and purpose-driven curiosity to ask why without blame or judgment, then you can think about things in a different way. We talked about, the movie Doctor Strange and the advice he got before he first went into the sanctum. Might I give you some advice? Forget everything that you know. This is kind of the advice I give Americans if they've never been to China and they're going to be assigned to work there. You first have to forget everything that you know, relearn the behaviors and how you should perform. And the goal is, of course, to create new patterns of interaction. So I always remind everybody that I'm currently crowdfunding a book. I think the crowdfunding campaign ends in like 2 days. Now, all of you who are on this call who registered will be getting a free copy, a free digital copy of the book when it's completed. So you guys will all get a copy. I have your email addresses from when you registered on Zoom. That was the reason I asked you to register on Zoom. You'll all be getting a free copy. But if you want to support me in my mission to improve U.S.-China relationships, one cross-cultural relationship at a time, you can pre-order a copy. I think there was links in the references from the Meetup announcement. It only goes on for one more day. But this is, all of the things that I'm talking about now are concepts that I share in the book. And the goal of the book is really to help the reader think differently about how they want to do business in China and actually have a chance to achieve a better and more positive outcome. All right, so that's the end of the formal part of the event. I'm gonna stop the share screen, and a couple people signed on late, so I wanna first ask Molly to unmute and maybe introduce yourself. As I said in the beginning, Molly specializes in working with German companies doing business in China. She's probably has a lot more experience in Germany than I do, so that will give her a huge advantage in explaining things in context to Germans to really understand what's going on in China. So Molly, the floor is yours. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you thought of my training and whatever else you wanted to do?
Okay, thanks, Gene.